September 15th, 1966, Las Vegas, Nevada. Dean Martin was sitting alone in his suite at the Sands Hotel, staring at an empty bottle of Jack Daniels and a loaded .38 revolver on the coffee table. The gun wasn't there for protection. Dean had been carrying it around for 3 days, and everyone who knew him was terrified of what he might do with it. His marriage was over. His career was in free fall. For the first time in his life, Dean Martin, the king of cool, was ready to give up. Then Frank Sinatra kicked down the door. Frank had a key to Dean's suite, earned through 15 years of Brotherhood. He took one look at Dean, sitting there in his bathrobe, unshaven, surrounded by empty bottles, and knew exactly what was happening. "Jesus Christ, Dean," Frank said quietly. "What the hell are you doing?" Dean didn't look up. "Having a drink. You want one?" Frank's eyes went to the gun. "That depends. What's the gun for?" "Protection," Dean said, with that trademark deadpan delivery. But there was no humor in it. Frank had never seen Dean without his spark, and it scared him more than any mob boss ever had. To understand what brought Dean to that moment, you need to understand what 1966 had been like for him. It started with his divorce from Jeannie Martin, his wife of 14 years. The divorce was ugly, public, and expensive. But the money wasn't what destroyed Dean, it was the custody battle. Jean was fighting for full custody of their children, using Dean's lifestyle against him. His drinking, his associations with the Rat Pack, his Las Vegas connections. She painted him as an unfit father. The worst part was that Dean was starting to believe it. His career was suffering too. The Dean Martin Show was struggling in the ratings. Dean's laid-back style, which had once seemed fresh, now looked lazy to younger viewers. The critics were brutal. "Dean Martin phones it in," wrote one reviewer. "He appears to be sleepwalking through his own show." The Rat Pack was starting to look dated. Frank was dealing with FBI surveillance and the Kennedy fallout. The whole group felt like yesterday's news. The breaking point came 3 days earlier. Dean had been performing at the Copa Room, going through his usual show. But halfway through Ain't That a Kick in the Head, he just stopped singing. The band kept playing, then trailed off into confused silence. Dean stood at the microphone, looking out at 2,800 people. Then he said, "I'm sorry, folks. I can't do this tonight." And he walked off the stage. Dean Martin didn't walk off stages. Dean was the consummate professional, the man who could perform under any circumstances. But that night, Dean Martin walked away from everything. He locked himself in his suite and started drinking. Not the casual drinking that was part of his image, but serious, destructive drinking. He was trying to numb the pain of losing his children, his career, his identity. On the second night, Dean called his lawyer and asked about his life insurance policy. How much was it worth? Who were the beneficiaries? The lawyer, alarmed by Dean's tone, immediately called Frank Sinatra. Frank was in Los Angeles, recording an album, when he got the call. He dropped everything, chartered a private jet, and flew to Las Vegas. He didn't call ahead, he just came. Because that's what Frank Sinatra did for Dean Martin. They were brothers, and brothers don't let brothers face their demons alone. When Frank walked into that suite and saw Dean with the gun, he realized this wasn't just a personal crisis. This was life and death. His best friend was ready to end it all, and Frank Sinatra was not going to let that happen. Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin's friendship began in 1946 at the Copacabana in New York City. Frank was already a star, the skinny kid from Hoboken who'd conquered the world. Dean was still Dino Crossetti from Steubenville, Ohio, a small-town kid trying to make it in the big leagues. They were performing on the same bill, and Frank noticed something special about the tall, dark-haired singer with the lazy smile and effortless charm. "This guy's got it," Frank told his manager that night. "Whatever it is, he's got more of it than anyone I've ever seen." But it wasn't Dean's talent that made Frank fall in love with him as a friend. It was his character. In a business full of phonies and yes men, Dean Martin was completely authentic. He didn't kiss up to Frank because he was famous. He didn't try to impress him or use him. Dean treated Frank exactly the same whether they were alone or in front of a crowd of reporters. More importantly, Dean made Frank laugh, real laughter, not the polite chuckles that Frank got from everyone else. Dean had a way of deflating Frank's ego with a perfectly timed joke, of bringing him back to earth when the fame and power went to his head. "You know what I like about you, Dino?" Frank told him one night in 1947. "You don't give a damn that I'm Frank Sinatra." "Should I?" Dean replied with that sleepy smile. "I mean, it's not like you're Dean Martin." Frank laughed so hard he nearly fell off his bar stool. From that moment on, they were inseparable. Their friendship deepened through the 1,950 seconds as they conquered Hollywood together. Frank got Dean into movies, Dean got Frank to relax. They formed the Rat Pack not as a publicity stunt, but as a genuine brotherhood. When Frank was going through his divorce from Ava Gardner and his career was in ruins, Dean was there. When Dean was struggling to find his identity as a solo performer after splitting from Jerry Lewis, Frank was there. They had an unspoken code. No matter what happened in their personal or professional lives, they would always be there for each other. No questions asked, no judgments made, just complete, unwavering loyalty. Which is why Frank was sitting in Dean's suite at 3 a.m. on September 15th, 1966, looking at his best friend with a gun on the table. "Dean, look at me," Frank said, sitting down across from him. "Look at me. Not the bottle, not the gun. Look at me." Dean finally raised his eyes. They were bloodshot, empty, defeated. Frank had seen Dean drunk 1,000 times, but this was different. This wasn't the fun-loving, carefree drinking that was part of Dean's image. This was despair. "Talk to me," Frank said. "Tell me what's happening in that head of yours." Dean was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I lost them, Frank. My kids. Jean's gonna take them away from me, and I can't stop her. I can't even blame her. What kind of father disappears for weeks at a time? What kind of father chooses Vegas over his children?" Frank leaned forward. "The kind of father who's providing for those children. The kind who's building something for them. You think you're a bad father because you work? Because you travel? My old man worked in the shipyards 14 hours a day. I barely saw him. That didn't make him a bad father." "It's different," Dean said. "Your father was respectable. What am I? A drunk who sings songs and hangs around with mobsters? Johnny's right. The kids are better off without me." Frank stood up abruptly and walked to the window overlooking the strip. The neon lights were still blazing even at this late hour, casting everything in artificial colors. "You want to know what you are, Dean? You're the most decent man I've ever known. You're the guy who remembers every crew member's name on every set. You're the guy who pays for his musicians' kids to go to college. You're the guy who visits sick fans in hospitals and never tells anyone about it." Dean shook his head. "That doesn't matter now." "It's the only thing that matters." Frank turned back to face him. "You think your kids are going to remember that you traveled for work? Or are they going to remember that their father was Dean Martin? That their father was talented and generous and funny and kind?" Frank sat back down and reached for the gun on the table. Dean didn't try to stop him. Frank checked the chamber, saw it was loaded, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Here's what we're going to do," Frank said. "You're going to shower, shave, and put on a clean suit. Then we're going to go downstairs and you're going to finish the show you walked out on 3 days ago. And tomorrow we're going to call the best lawyers in the country and fight for your kids." "Frank, I can't." "Yes, you can, because you're Dean Martin. And Dean Martin doesn't quit." Getting Dean Martin to shower and shave was easy. Getting him to believe in himself again was the hard part. Frank sat on the couch while Dean got ready, watching his friend move like a man walking to his own execution. Every movement was deliberate, mechanical, like he was going through the motions of living without actually being alive. "You don't have to do this for me," Dean said from the bathroom, his voice echoing off the tiles. "I know you're trying to help, but some things can't be fixed." "Nothing can't be fixed," Frank replied. "Some things just take more work than others." When Dean emerged 20 minutes later, he looked like Dean Martin again. The perfectly tailored suit, the slicked back hair, the confident posture. But Frank could see through the disguise. Dean was performing being Dean Martin the way he'd been performing his whole life. "How do I look?" Dean asked. "Like $1,000,000, but that's not what matters." "What matters?" Frank walked over to Dean and put his hands on his friend's shoulders. "What matters is that you remember who you are when you get up on that stage, not who Jean says you are. Not who the critics say you are. who you really are. They took the elevator down to the Copa room in silence. Frank could feel Dean's tension radiating through the small space. When the doors opened, they were greeted by Mickey Rudin, Frank's lawyer, who had been waiting in the hallway. "Frank, the casino manager is having kittens," Mickey said. "Dean's been out for 3 days. The customers are demanding refunds. The press is asking questions." "Let me worry about the press," Frank said. "You just make sure that stage is ready." As they walked toward the Copa room, Frank could hear the crowd inside. It was smaller than usual. Word had gotten out about Dean's walk-off 3 nights earlier. But there were still about 1,500 people waiting to see if Dean Martin would show up. "What if I can't do it?" Dean whispered as they reached the backstage area. "What if I get out there and freeze up again?" Frank stopped walking. "Then you freeze up. And then you keep trying until you don't freeze up anymore. But you're not going to freeze up, because you've never frozen up in your entire life. 3 nights ago, you were human. Tonight, you're Dean Martin again." The band was on stage, playing filler music, waiting for word on whether the show would actually happen. Frank walked out to the band leader and whispered something in his ear. The man nodded and gestured to the musicians. Frank came back to Dean. "They're going to play your entrance music in 60 seconds. You ready?" Dean looked out at the crowd through a gap in the curtain. "Frank, what if they hate me? What if they boo me for walking out?" "Then they boo you, and you sing anyway, because that's what professionals do." Frank could see Dean's hand shaking slightly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out Dean's .38 revolver. "You want this back?" Dean looked at the gun for a long moment. "No, I don't need it anymore." Frank smiled for the first time in 3 days. "Good. Because I've got better plans for you than checking out early." The band struck up the opening notes of Dean's entrance music. Frank gave Dean a gentle push toward the stage. "Go show them why you're the king of cool." Dean Martin walked onto the stage of the Copa room to thunderous applause. The crowd was on their feet before he even reached the microphone. They weren't booing him for walking out 3 nights earlier. They were celebrating his return. Dean stood at the microphone for a moment, looking out at the audience. Then he spoke, his voice clear and strong. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to apologize for leaving you hanging the other night. I had some personal business to attend to, but I'm back now and I'm not going anywhere." The crowd roared its approval. Dean launched into "That's Amore," and from the first note, Frank knew his friend was back. The voice was strong, the timing perfect, the charm undeniable. This wasn't a man going through the motions. This was Dean Martin, doing what he was born to do. Frank watched from the wings, feeling a mixture of relief and pride that almost overwhelmed him. He had saved his best friend's life, but more than that, he had saved Dean Martin for the world. After the show, Dean found Frank in his dressing room. "Thank you," Dean said simply. "Don't thank me, thank yourself. You're the one who got up there and did it." Dean sat down heavily in a chair. "I meant thank you for not letting me give up." Frank poured 2 glasses of Jack Daniels and handed one to Dean. "That's what friends do, Dino. They don't let each other quit." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 men who had just been through hell together and come out the other side. "Frank," Dean said finally, "if you ever need anything at all, you call me. Day or night, I'll be there." "I know you will, partner. I know you will." The next morning, Frank made good on his promise. He called the 3 best divorce lawyers in California and arranged meetings for Dean. Then he called his own publicist and had them start working on rebuilding Dean's image. Frank understood that saving Dean's life was only the beginning. Now they had to save his reputation and his relationship with his children. The custody battle lasted 8 months. Frank was there for every court appearance, every deposition, every moment when Dean needed support. He testified as a character witness, describing Dean as the most devoted father I've ever known. More importantly, Frank helped Dean prove it. Frank arranged for Dean to cut back his Vegas commitments so he could spend more time with his kids. He helped Dean buy a house in Beverly Hills, closer to where Jean and the children lived. And when Dean's confidence wavered, which happened often during those difficult months, Frank was there to remind him why he was fighting. "Your kids need their father," Frank would tell him. "Not a perfect father, just their father, the real Dean Martin." not some cleaned up version that lawyers think looks better in court. The judge ultimately awarded Dean joint custody. It wasn't everything he'd hoped for, but it was enough. More importantly, Dean had learned something about himself during those 8 months. He had learned that he was stronger than he thought, that he could fight for what mattered, and that he didn't have to face his battles alone. Dean's career also recovered. The Dean Martin Show found its footing again, running successfully for another 8 years. His recording career experienced a renaissance. Most importantly, Dean found his confidence, again, not the manufactured confidence of a performer, but the genuine confidence of a man who knew his own worth. But the real victory was something deeper. The crisis had stripped away everything superficial about Dean Martin, the cool image, the effortless charm, the I don't care attitude, and revealed the man underneath. A man who loved his children desperately. A man who cared deeply about his work and his friends. A man worth saving. Frank never spoke publicly about that night in September 1966. When reporters asked about Dean's brief disappearance from the stage, Frank would deflect with jokes or change the subject. But privately, Frank considered it one of the most important things he'd ever done. Not because he'd saved Dean Martin the entertainer, but because he'd saved Dean Martin the man. Their friendship became even stronger after that night. They had shared something that went beyond the usual bonds of show business friendships. Dean had shown Frank his deepest vulnerability, and Frank had proven his absolute loyalty. That kind of trust, once given and honored, lasts forever. For the rest of their lives, whenever one of them was in trouble, the other would drop everything and come running. When Frank was going through his own dark periods, and there were many, Dean was there with the same unwavering support Frank had shown him. They had learned the most important lesson friendship can teach. Sometimes saving someone else saves you too. Frank's determination to rescue Dean had reminded him of his own capacity for goodness, his own ability to put someone else's needs before his own. In a business built on competition and ego, Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin had found something rare and precious, a friendship worth saving, a brotherhood worth fighting for, a bond that could survive anything, including the worst moments of their own lives. Years later, when Dean Martin was asked about the secret to his comeback in the late 1960 seconds, he would always give the same answer. I had a friend who wouldn't let me quit. But those who knew the real story understood something deeper. Frank Sinatra didn't just save Dean Martin's life that night in Las Vegas. He proved that in a world built on competition and self-interest, genuine friendship could still exist. The entertainment industry is littered with stories of betrayal, abandonment, and broken promises. But Frank and Dean's friendship became something different, a testament to what's possible when two people decide that loyalty matters more than convenience. They never spoke publicly about that September night in 1966. It wasn't a story for the press or the fans. It was a private moment between brothers, a secret they carried together until Dean's death in 1995. At Dean's funeral, Frank could barely speak. When he finally stood to address the mourners, he said simply, "Dean was my brother, not by blood, but by choice. And I would have done anything for him, just as he would have done anything for me." That's the real legacy of Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. Not the movies or the music or the fame. It's the reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do in life is simply refuse to let the people you love give up on themselves. Because that's what real friendship means. That's what brotherhood looks like. That's what love does.